This is The Meaning of Green Season 4. I'm Vivian Thomson. In Season 1 of The Meaning of Green, my guests and I examined how we have managed to solve or not to solve major environmental problems, and we applied the policy lessons we had learned to climate change. Season 2 investigated the links between power, freedom, and the environment, and whether those links shed light on the coronavirus's emergence and spread. Season 3 looked at place and the environment. We traveled to different locations in the U.S. and around the world, characterized their environmental issues and possible remedies, and explored connections with other places. Season 4 is about environmental and public health protection during challenging economic times. The Meaning of Green is independently produced in Cedar Closet Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland, and has no sponsor. No outside entity influences the content of this podcast. Before I started The Meaning of Green, I was for 20 years a professor of environmental policy at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Outside of academia, I have also been an environmental regulatory official in Virginia and at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. My 3 published books are about garbage transport, climate change policy in the U.S., Brazil, and Germany, and about who wields power and how when we regulate air pollution. You can find out more about The Meaning of Green and find links for all podcast episodes at the podcast's website, meaningofgreen.com. This episode and the following episode are about different ways of seeing the Amazon forest. Last July, my family and I visited the southern part of the Amazon forest in Brazil's state of Mato Grosso. We saw the forest, we experienced it in first person, and I'll tell you what we saw. But these 2 episodes are also about the different ways in which one can see the Amazon forest through the lenses of science, politics, economics, and history. This episode is accompanied by a YouTube video. You can find the link for the video under videos at meaningofgreen.com. My very first visit to Brazil involved another forest that is considered one of the top 5 biodiversity hotspots in the world, the Atlantic forest. In 1986, I was a young analyst at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. I was part of an international team of policy and scientific experts who had been invited to Brazil by environmental authorities for the state of São Paulo. Brazil had just emerged from 2 decades of a brutal, repressive dictatorship. The São Paulo environmental authorities wanted us to help support their efforts to clean up Cubatão, which had been called by the World Health Organization the most polluted city on Earth. Cubatão is roughly a 90-minute drive from central São Paulo, depending on traffic, of course. São Paulo is famous for its truly epic traffic jams. Cubatão is squeezed between the sea and the coastal mountains that rise steeply to 3,000 feet. It's close to Santos, one of Brazil's major ports. Cubatão is the site of a huge petrochemical complex whose origins date to the 1950s, but which expanded greatly under the military government in the 60s and 70s. The extraordinary amount of air pollution created by those facilities could not disperse easily over the tall mountains. Rather, it collected and cooked in the hot tropical sun. Here we find remnants of the rich Atlantic forest, which once extended for almost 2,000 miles along Brazil's coastline, but has been reduced to a mere fraction of its former extent. Proclaiming that Cubatão was crucial to national security, the dictatorship suppressed research on the public health and environmental consequences of the area's heavy fog of air pollution. One authoritative source says that the companies operated with impunity, with no accountability to anyone but the military government. Of Cubatão, one health expert said in the early 1980s, quote, "Theoretically, by the level of pollution, there shouldn't be life there. Rain was so acidic it burned the skin. Local residents, many living in poverty, experienced devastating health effects, including birth defects. The area came to be called the Valley of Death. Dead plants dotted the steep mountainsides hosting the Atlantic forest, leaving what looked like tall toothpicks and areas completely devoid of plants altogether. This, in turn, reportedly led to 1,800 landslides between 1962 and 1988. The YouTube video depicts that damage as we photographed it in 1986. You can see photos of the industrial complex, of the neighborhood known as Villa Parisi, of walls built to hold back landslides, and of the widespread damage in the Atlantic forest. On the mountain slopes, you can see deep, long, bare patches of soil where plants died and landslides happened. The international team wrote a report embracing the Brazilians' efforts to require drastic reductions in the area's pollution. Air quality is much improved since that time. This was my first direct contact with deforestation in Brazil. Over time, the Atlantic forest has been decimated by clearing for other land uses, but reforestation efforts are underway. In a later episode, I'll describe one such effort that's been initiated by my family members and their friends. My 1986 trip followed the overthrow of Brazil's military dictatorship, which was in power from 1964 to 1985. The dictatorship's devastating environmental policies will figure into the second of these two episodes. For now, let's take a brief look at the role of the United States in helping that dictatorship come to power. During the Cold War, the United States went to great lengths to quash socialism and communism around the world. Brazil's President Goulart, who took office in 1961, was a progressive. In a 1964 speech, he advocated nationalizing foreign oil companies, and he advanced various reforms aimed at lifting up the millions of Brazilians living in poverty. The Kennedy administration sought to destabilize Goulart's government. President Kennedy and his aides talked about whether a coup might succeed. Kennedy asked if the U.S. might have to intervene directly. JFK met with Goulart at the White House and at the Brazilian embassy in Washington, as shown in the video. Here is part of a 5-minute phone conversation President Johnson had with Undersecretary of State George Ball in late March 1964. In the recording, President Johnson's voice is much louder than that of Mr. Ball's. Unfortunately, that difference and the hum could not be edited out. In the video, you can see Mr. Ball and LBJ in various meetings. This recording is from the National Security Archive.
Hello?
Oh, Mr. President, this is George Ball.
Yes, George.
Tom Mann is on with me.
Hi, Tom.
A quick rundown of the situation in Brazil. We had a meeting this morning with Bob McNamara, Max Taylor, and General O'Mara, who's come up overnight. And we decided on the basis of the information that had come in this morning, go ahead and start a naval task force out, but with no commitment, so that it'll be steaming down in that direction. It couldn't get into the area before April 10th. In the meantime, we can watch the developments and see whether it should go on or not. But it could be done in a way that doesn't create any kind of public stir. The second thing is I've located some Navy tankers in Aruba. And the big thing that they're going to need if they have a successful revolt down there at some point probably is some gasoline, both for motor vehicles and for the aviation. The tankers are going to be loaded, but again, they can't be down there till around April the 8th to the 13th. But this is a precautionary move that we're taking. Third is they're getting together a shipment of ammunition, but this will have to wait before we start moving it, because it'll probably have to be moved by plane, and that can only be done after the situation is verified, and we really decided to make a commitment in the situation. Now, what is actually happening on the field is very confused. We just had a teletype conversation with Link Gordon in Rio. It seems clear that the state just north of Rio, which is Minas Gerais, is in revolt. Both the Army and the civilian authorities of the state seem to be acting together, and the Army has apparently moved in and blocked the road from Rio so that the First Army in Rio couldn't move up and stop the revolt. We're waiting for some clarification of the situation in Sao Paulo, which is the key to the matter. There's apparently been no movement in Sao Paulo, but there's some expected at almost any moment, and we should know within the next few hours what's happening. I've instructed Gordon not to take any more contact with the Brazilians until we see how the situation develops. I think there has to be some more movement in Sao Paulo to make sure that this thing is going to move, and we don't want to get ourselves committed before we know how the thing is going to come out. He feels that on the basis of the momentum that's been started so far, it could wait for 12 hours before anything has to be, or overnight before we have to take any decision on whether we should or shouldn't move. And I think that we can see the developments and then make a judgment on it. I gather you're planning on coming back for us tonight.
Yeah, I'll be in there about 8:30.
Well, we may have another meeting this afternoon with McNamara, but in any event, we'll be changing this situation. But I did want you to know that.
I think we ought to take every step that we can, be prepared to do everything that we need to do, just as we were in Panama, if that is at all feasible.
Right. We're canvassing all the possibilities to make sure we're not.
I'd put everybody that had any imagination or ingenuity in the Gordon's outfit, or McCone's, or Yaw's, or McNamara's, and we just can't take this one. And I'd get right on top of it and stick my neck out a little.
Right. We do. Well, this is just our own feeling about it, and
The U.S. military did not become involved directly because the Brazilian military undertook a successful coup. The declassified tapes and papers around the U.S.'s discussion of intervention in Brazil reflect blinkered thinking about the perceived threat of communism. President Johnson referred to Panama. Johnson had been criticized for not responding more forcefully to Panamanian protests in January 1964 against the U.S.'s occupation of the Panama Canal Zone. Perhaps this factor contributed in a presidential election year to President Johnson's shocking willingness to support the military coup in Brazil. My point is this: when we think about the many ways in which the Brazilian military degraded Brazil's environment, coup d'etat is not the only example, you should hold in mind that the U.S. supported and stood ready to aid the military's takeover. Brazil's lush forests are integral to the country's identity. The national flag has a solid green background which represents the country's forests. So I was a little surprised when a colleague at one of Brazil's leading universities said he thought that most Brazilians had never visited the Amazon forest. Even though the Amazon forest covers a vast amount of the country's territory, it takes a long time to get there from Brazil's major population centers. Although those cities lie far away from the forest, they depend on it for their very survival. The Amazon forest is the goose that laid the golden egg, according to Dr. Carlos Antonio Nobri, one of the foremost experts on the Amazon forest. Dr. Nobri is now at the University of São Paulo. Here's Dr. Nobri in a YouTube clip called Rivers in the Sky. He talks about the key role of the Amazon forest in creating the rainy climate that much of South America depends on. I'll translate for Dr. Nobri. In addition to producing moisture for itself, it produces a phenomenon popularly known as flying rivers, which explains the mystery of why the region that goes from Cuiabá, Buenos Aires, and São Paulo to the Andes is green and humid. This region is responsible for 70% of the GDP of South America. Here we find hydroelectric dams, agriculture, industry, large urban centers. And the explanation is in the rivers of vapor that the Amazon forest exports to this region and counteracts the natural tendency of the region to be a desert. You have this immense power plant providing ecosystem services, which I call the largest technological park that Earth has known. And what has been done to the Amazon? Our interaction with this power plant providing ecosystem services is tearing it down and burning it. We're transforming this power plant of ecosystem services into gas. What is the logical conclusion? It's that we are killing the goose that laid the golden egg. The worsening of the climate resulting from deforestation is irrefutable. Losing the forest means preparing for an inhospitable climate. There are demonstrated alternatives in which one can stop deforestation and replant the forest. But we must have patience in this reconstruction. The tree needs decades to produce all of these effects. The Amazon forest is thought to transpire more water in one day than is discharged by the Amazon River to the Atlantic Ocean in one day. And the Amazon River accounts for 1/5 of the world's freshwater discharges to the sea. In essence, the Amazon forest creates its own rainfall, with its trees sending up huge amounts of water into the atmosphere. Flying rivers of moisture generated by the forest move south and east to other parts of Brazil and South America. Those bands of moisture feed dams and reservoirs in Brazil's south and southeast. I have really wanted to see those flying rivers. Our Amazon forest lodge, called Cristalino, has metal towers that rise above the tree canopy. From the top of the towers, which are 50 meters tall, you can see the clouds that form those flying rivers. Cristalino caught my attention for a number of reasons. Cristalino has hosted many scientists since the 1990s, and it's clearly a site of great biological interest. Over the years, Cristalino's protected reserves have grown to about 44 square miles in size, or about two-thirds the size of Washington, D.C. The lodge was built carefully over many years to be as compatible with the forest as possible. For all these reasons, Cristalino became our destination. Our trip commenced in Rio de Janeiro, where we boarded the first of 3 flights to travel about 1,700 miles to the city of Alta Floresta. Our party consisted of my husband, Pat, my daughter, Flora, and my daughter-in-law, Paulinha. Flora and Paulinha live and work in Rio, where they produce podcasts in Brazilian Portuguese for a company called Rádio Novelo. A short digression. In November 2022, just after the U.S. elections, Rádio Novelo interviewed New York Congressman George Santos, who has become famous for the seemingly endless list of fantastic tales he has spun about his life and career. In the interview, he claimed that he was robbed in New York City in broad daylight on a very busy corner in an affluent part of Midtown Manhattan. The muggers supposedly took his briefcase, his watch, and his shoes. My husband and I just traveled to that area of Manhattan. When we neared that corner, we hung on tightly to our shoes. Okay, back to our travels from Rio to the Amazon forest. Each stage of our journey opened a door to new sights, some stunningly marvelous, some profoundly upsetting. The part of the Amazon forest that's in the state of Mato Grosso is among the parts that have been most severely deforested. Dr. Luciana Gatti at Brazil's National Institute for Space Research has studied how much carbon dioxide various parts of the Amazon forest are emitting. She has also studied rainfall and temperature patterns. Her technique for measuring carbon dioxide was pathbreaking and difficult to accomplish. In a small plane, she grabbed samples of the air in one column, starting at 14,000 feet, as the pilot descended in tight spirals to 1,000 feet. One gets a little airsick and dizzy just thinking about this technique. Here's Dr. Gatti in an interview with the Global Landscapes Forum in 2021. By tipping point, she means the point at which deforestation changes climate and rainfall patterns so as to transform the forest into savanna. That is to say, a grassy plain with few trees.
We have many Amazons, many forests inside the Amazon, and many regions are in a very different condition. Some regions is much more deforested and the others less deforested. When we look, for example, the east of the Amazon, for example, Pará and the north of Mato Grosso state, in our study, we are talking about around 2 million kilometers square of region. This is around 27% deforested until December 2018. This is very important to highlight. Our study was until December 2018. What's the consequence in these actions when we observed clearly a change in the climatic conditions of forest? And then we make the question, what change in each part of the Amazon? Then we calculate how much was deforested, each region of influence for studied areas. And also we study 40 years precipitation and temperature in each regions. And then everything makes sense. Northeast, that is the biggest emission, is also the biggest deforestation. This region is 37% deforested. We are talking about 20% the tipping point. This region is 37% deforested. Until December 2018, I just arrived from there 10 days ago, and then now it's much, much more, near Flona Tapajós, you observe a green soybean, ocean.
That's quite a vivid image. Dr. Gacci's description of a sea of soybeans in Brazil's deforested northeast region.
It's a nightmare, they are deforesting. I believe now is more than 40%. And this explains why is the biggest carbon emission, and also explain the big impact in the precipitation. The biggest impact in the whole Amazon is during dry season, August, September, October. And this is make really difference for forest. If you rain more or less during wet season, don't make too much difference for forest because they are not below stress. But in dry season, they are below stress. Then changes in dry season impact extremely the forest functions. This is nightmare. How can trees survive a so big stress?
Dr. Gacci then referred to another study of tree mortality and cited some of the statistics for that same area of the Amazon that includes the state of Mato Grosso.
When you look at the study from Adriana Esquivel, for example, she make a mortality map in Amazon. In this region, the mortality is 2-3 times higher than other parts of the Amazon.
Brazil is the world's leading soybean and beef exporter. Agriculture is hugely important to the Brazilian economy, and a tropical climate allows for multiple plantings yearly. The U.S. imports a lot of Brazilian beef, which is under scrutiny right now because of reports of mad cow disease. The majority of Brazilian soy exports go to China, with a chunk also going to the European Union. I'll return to that point in the next episode. Dr. Gacci's research underscores the increase in dry season temperatures and decrease in rainfall in the part of the Amazon that includes northern Mato Grosso. As of 2018, that region was 27% deforested, and in the previous 40 years, it showed 24% lower rainfall and a mean dry season temperature that had risen by 2.5 degrees C or 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. These climatic changes increase the area's vulnerability to fires. The place where Dr. Gacci documented these measures of deforestation and climate change was not terribly far from the lush protected forest at Cristalino Lodge. And remember, once tropical forests fall, they don't come back naturally. That's because the plants suck up nutrients that might otherwise build up in the soil. The bare soil is depleted and does not provide sufficient nutrients for natural reforestation. Some of our first sights after landing in Alta Floresta testified starkly to Dr. Gacci's observations. At the small airport, we were met by our driver, who would take us to a motorboat that, in turn, would take us to the lodge. We drove through Alta Floresta, a city of about 50,000 people. There is little evidence of the forest that once covered the area, with one exception. The woman who established Cristalino Lodge, Vitória da Riva Carvalho, preserved a large block of forest around her hotel in Alta Floresta. You can see that dense swath of green clearly on satellite photos of the area. It had been dry in Mato Grosso and it was hot, so we traveled with the car windows up to keep the red dust from flying into the car. Much of the trip to the river happened on rutted dirt roads. Our driver spoke of the hardship caused to farmers by low rainfall. As we drove through the countryside, we saw dry agricultural fields to the right and to the left. The major crops in the area are corn and soybeans. A few majestic Brazil nut trees dotted the landscape. They can grow as tall as 200 feet and live for hundreds of years. Farmers are supposed to protect Brazil nut trees, which have declined greatly in number and are protected by law. It was sad to see those lonely trees. Brazil nut trees cannot reproduce in isolation from the forest because they are pollinated by one bee species whose females are uniquely adapted to pollinate the tree's flowers. The bees' males attract females by visiting orchids and dousing themselves with orchid fragrance. No forest, no orchids, no bee reproduction, no pollination, no nuts. As we bumped along the road to the Teles Pires River, the dry, dusty fields began to yield to forest. We stopped to look at Cristalino's organic garden, which supplied some of the food served at the lodge. We sampled some fruit of the cashew tree, but we were warned against any contact with the husk of the unripe nuts. Those husks contain urushiol, the same toxic compound that is found in poison ivy and poison oak. We recalled the story of the American poet Elizabeth Bishop, who, while visiting Rio in 1951, had a terrible allergic reaction when she tasted the fleshy part of the cashew fruit. She was nursed back to health by the Brazilian Lota de Macedo Soares, and the two became a couple. Lota designed Rio's extensive flamenco park, and we think of her whenever we take strolls along its tree-lined paths. At last, we arrived at the Telespires River, where a small motorboat awaited us. We met Mauricio, who would guide us for the duration of our stay. Our skilled boatman was Sandro, who had a detailed mental map of the river's features and currents. In the following episode, I'll pick up the story of our trip here at the Telespires River. To summarize the different ways of seeing the Amazon that I've touched on in this episode, impoverished Brazilians have seen and continue to see the Amazon forest as a place where they can grow crops or raise cattle or mine for gold. Multinational companies export those products. Scientists see the forest as a climate regulator that makes its own rainfall and exports vast amounts of moisture to much of the rest of South America. Brazilians and others around the world understand the Amazon as a place of extraordinary, unexplored biodiversity, as the place where hundreds of indigenous peoples live, and as the lungs of the planet, gulping in carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen. And those lungs are in trouble. The U.S. government saw Brazil as a potential communist threat and was willing to help oust President Goulart. Brazil's military dictatorship pushed industrialization and clearing of forests in the name of national security and economic development. Cubatão's devastating public health and environmental problems, including widespread plant death in the Atlantic forest, resulted from the dictatorship's policies. In the next episode, we'll explore the question of how the area around Alta Floresta came to be so deforested and urbanized. That story involves the military dictatorship. I'll tell you what it was like to visit intact Amazon forest, to wind along the Cristalino River, and to see the forest from above. You'll learn about the founder of Alta Floresta, Ariosto da Riva Neto, the father of the founder of Cristalino Lodge, Vitória da Riva Carvalho. I found a catchy song on YouTube that literally sings Ariosto's praises. This is in Brazilian Portuguese, of course, but here's a bit of that song. The composer is Rosalio Santos Almeida. Rosalio speaks of Ariosto as a hero of Brazil and says, basically, thank you for all the wonderful things you did for Alta Floresta.
Está de parabéns, muito obrigado, seu Ariosto, outro igual você, o Brasil não tem. Muito obrigado, seu Ariosto, outro igual você, o Brasil não tem. Muito obrigado, seu Ariosto, outro igual você, o Brasil não tem.
I'm Vivian Thomson. Thank you for listening to The Meaning of Green, Season 4.